You're asleep on open ground, 100,000 years ago, with nothing between you and the dark but a dying fire. Somewhere out there, something with teeth is awake, hunting, and fully capable of ending you in seconds. And yet, statistically, it almost certainly won't. Here's the question nobody really asks. Why not? Sleep is, on paper, the single worst thing a prey animal can do. You go still, you go quiet, you stop watching. For 8 hours or so, every single night, our ancestors handed over total control of their fate to whatever happened to be nearby. And they did this for hundreds of thousands of years, across open savannas, dense forests, and cave mouths shared with actual lions. If predators simply hunted whatever was easiest, humans should have been wiped out early and often. We weren't. And the reasons why turn out to be a lot stranger and a lot more interesting than we got lucky. Let's start with the most basic possible explanation. Maybe predators just genuinely avoid us. Researcher Liana Zanet and her colleague Michael Clinchy ran an experiment in South Africa's Greater Kruger region that's become one of the more famous studies in this field. They set up hidden speakers near watering holes and played recorded sounds to wildlife passing through. Lions roaring, dogs barking, gunshots, and ordinary human voices calmly talking. Here's the thing nobody tells you about that result. Animals fled from the sound of calm human conversation nearly twice as often, and noticeably faster than they fled from actual lions. Not gunshots, not aggressive shouting, just people talking normally. Zanet and Clinchy's conclusion was blunt. Across the ecosystems they studied, animals treat humans as the most frightening predator on the landscape. More frightening than lions, more frightening than anything else with claws. We are, functionally, the scariest thing many of these animals will ever encounter. That's not a modern development either. It's almost certainly ancient, baked into how prey and predator species alike have learned to categorize us over an extremely long stretch of shared history. Now, here's where it gets interesting, because fear alone doesn't fully explain sleeping safety. You're at your least threatening while unconscious. So something else has to be doing a lot of the work. That something is fire. Researcher Craig Packer, who has spent decades studying lion behavior in Africa, has documented repeatedly that lions show strong, consistent avoidance of active flame. Not because fire physically threatens them in the moment, but because it disrupts nearly everything a predator relies on to hunt safely. Depth perception in flickering light, the element of surprise, easy escape routes. A campfire doesn't just illuminate a camp. It turns the area around it into unfamiliar, high-risk terrain for an ambush predator that survives by minimizing exactly that kind of risk. And this defense goes back a long way. Evidence of controlled fire use at Wonderwork Cave in South Africa dates back roughly 1 million years, long before our own species even existed. Whatever hominin was tending that fire wasn't just cooking or staying warm, they were almost certainly buying themselves safer sleep. That's not a coincidence. That's one of the oldest security systems humans ever built, and it's still functionally identical to a modern campsite fire-keeping animals at a distance. But fire alone can't explain everything, because plenty of our ancestors slept in places without much fuel to burn, or with fires that inevitably burned low by early morning. So there's another layer to this. Sleeping in groups. Anthropologist David Sampson has studied sleep patterns among modern hunter-gatherer groups like the Hadza of Tanzania, and found something that looks almost engineered. Individual sleep schedules within a group are naturally staggered. Some people drift off earlier, some later, some wake briefly in the middle of the night. Sampson's research found that across an entire night, there's rarely a moment when every single person in camp is asleep at once. Someone, somewhere in that group, is almost always at least partially alert. That's not a formal night watch rotation with assigned shifts. Nobody's standing guard on purpose. It's just what naturally happens when a group of humans with slightly different internal clocks sleep near each other. And the effect is the same either way. A predator assessing a sleeping human group isn't looking at defenseless, unconscious prey. It's looking at a cluster where the odds of something noticing it are uncomfortably high. Predators, it turns out, are exceptionally good at running that kind of risk calculation. Here's the thing nobody tells you about predator behavior in general. Hunting is expensive. A failed ambush costs energy, sometimes costs an injury, and injury for a wild predator is often a slow death sentence, since a hobbled lion or leopard can't hunt effectively for weeks. Because of that cost, predators are strongly biased toward targets that are unfamiliar, easy, and low risk. Humans, especially humans in a group, near fire, with unpredictable movement and alertness, score badly on all 3 counts. That doesn't mean the risk was zero. It's important to be honest about that. The fossil record actually preserves direct evidence of predation on early hominins. The Taung Child, a roughly 2.8 million-year-old Australopithecus africanus skull discovered in South Africa, shows puncture marks and damage patterns that researcher Lee Berger and colleagues matched closely to eagle talon damage, suggesting the child was likely killed by a large bird of prey. At other sites, hominin remains have been found found alongside leopard fossils with skull puncture marks that closely match a leopard's canine spacing, evidence that researchers including paleoanthropologist C.K. Brain used to argue for direct leopard predation on early human ancestors. So predation absolutely happened. Early hominins were not invincible, and were not universally avoided. But here's where it gets interesting again. That evidence is relatively rare compared to how common and vulnerable sleeping humans actually were, night after night for millions of years combined. If predators regularly and easily killed sleeping humans, the fossil and ethnographic record would be full of it. It isn't, which means whatever combination of group sleeping, fire, and reputation was operating, it was working far more often than it was failing. And that reputation deserves one more layer of explanation because it isn't just about individual encounters. It's cultural, in a sense, passed down within predator populations themselves. Researchers studying predator learning have found that animals, especially long-lived, intelligent predators like lions and leopards, build up something close to a behavioral memory across a population. A predator that has a bad, costly, or simply confusing experience near humans tends to avoid similar situations afterward, and that caution can spread through observation within a local group of animals. Enough negative or high-risk encounters with humans over generations. And an entire local predator population starts treating human camps as a category to avoid by default, not something to individually reassess every single night. In other words, we didn't just get lucky once. We built, without ever intending to, a kind of standing reputation across the animal world that made us not worth the trouble. Put all of that together, and the picture looks less like luck and more like layered defense. Fire disrupting a predator's normal hunting advantages. Group sleep patterns that guarantee at least partial alertness somewhere in camp almost around the clock. A species-wide reputation among predators as unusually risky and unpredictable prey. And underneath all of it, a genuine, measurable fear response that multiple studies now show outranks even lions on the list of things wild animals are afraid of. None of that made sleeping completely safe. Nothing in the ancient world was completely safe. But it tilted the odds dramatically, night after night, for long enough that a species that spends roughly a third of its life unconscious and defenseless still managed to spread across almost the entire planet. So picture that scene again. You're asleep on open ground, 100,000 years ago. The fire's burned down to embers. Somewhere out there, something with teeth is awake, and it can hear you breathing. It also remembers, on some level encoded by generations before it, that camps like this one are more trouble than they're worth. It hears the low murmur of someone shifting in their sleep nearby, sees the last orange glow of a fire it doesn't trust, and it moves on, towards something quieter, something that isn't watching even in its sleep. Nobody standing guard chose that outcome on purpose. Nobody was awake, calculating the odds. It happened anyway, night after night, for hundreds of thousands of nights, built from nothing more than flame, proximity, and a reputation earned one uneasy predator at a time. And somehow, out of exactly that kind of ordinary, half-conscious vulnerability, our ancestors slept safely enough, often enough, to still be here telling the story.